once upon a time, there was a salesman that was called to do the south part of the state to do his selling down there. And he had been selling for most of the morning when he got there, been selling most of the morning. And he stopped at this little store to get some gas in his car and to get him cold drinks, some crackers. And he stopped and he was talking with the man at the counter. And the man asked him, he says, "Hey, are you here to do some fishing?" He says, "I didn't. I'm a salesman, but I do like to fish. And if there's any fishing around, I don't know, what you got? What you have in mind?" And the man behind the counter says, "Well, there's the biggest catfish in the whole world right here close by. It's Grandma Blue, and she is the biggest catfish. They've tried and tried and tried to catch her, but nobody can catch her. They've seen her, and a couple of times some people have hooked her, but nobody's ever caught her. So if you want to try, I can sell you some. I can sell you a good fishing rig if you want to go give it a try." And so the salesman thought for a minute. He said, "Well, he looked at his watch. He said, "Well, I got a little time. Maybe yeah, go ahead and set me up." So he set him up with a rod and some bait and stuff. And so and they went where the man behind the counter told him to go. And he pulled up to this little creek, and it was pretty blue water, and they're in the shady trees, and it was just a beautiful place. And he's looking, and he sees some turtles, and he sees some other little catfish running around, and he sees a couple of bass, and then over underneath the willow tree there was swirling in the water, and he thought, "Oh my goodness, that must, I wonder." And he looked and he stared real close. And then he saw, and it was the biggest catfish he had ever seen in his life. And so what he done, he hurried up and opened up his rig, and he hurried up and baited the hook, and he tossed it out there in front of old Grandma Blue. And Grandma, she swam up to it, kind of smelled, there was like 4 or 5 worms on one big hook. And she smelled it for a minute, then she picked it up and started going away. And he set the hook, and the fight was on. And it lasted for about 45 minutes. And he pulled, and she pulled, and he pulled, and she pulled, and he was just about to give out. But I think she was give out even more, because finally he made up his mind that he wasn't going to be able to reel her in. He was just going to have to pull her in. So he dug in his heels, and he just started backing up, and he drug her up on the bank. And she started flouncing a little bit, and he says, "Oh my goodness, this thing is going to get back in the water." And so he looked around for something that he could tie, just something that he could tie her down. And all he found was this skillet, this big old skillet, cast iron skillet somebody left there. And so he grabbed this big old skillet, and he put it on the back of her head, and he took his line, and he just wrapped it all around there, and he wrapped that line around so that big old skillet was on there. And then he sat there, he sat down because he was give out, and she spit that bait out with the hook. And he said, "Oh my goodness, that's the biggest fight I've ever been in my life." And about that time she flopped, flop, flop, flop about 3 times, and she was back in the creek and gone. Well, he got mad. He started swearing big time bad, and he swore that he'd never fish again, and he left. He left the county, he went back home, and he just decided to do his selling around where he lived. Well, it was about a year later that he figured he'd go back down again. He had calmed down enough after a year. He went down and done some selling, and everything was fine, and he was doing okay. And then he stopped at that little store, that same little store that he stopped by last time. And he asked that fella, him and that fella was talking, and he says, "So anybody ever catch Grandma Blue?" And the man says, "Nope, she's still out there, and I think she's bigger this year than she was last year." He says, "Oh my goodness. Maybe I'll just take a ride. I've got my rod in the car. Maybe I'll just take a ride down there and see what's going on." So he took a drive down in the woods and pulled up, and it was still a beautiful creek and pretty blue water and shady and everything. And he sat there looking around. He saw some turtles and he saw some bass, and then he saw the water swirl again. And here she come. Here come Grandma Blue right up to the bank, and he could see her, and she was bigger than ever. That catfish was big. And then he looked real close, and he could see over here there was a bunch of little bitty catfish swimming next to her. Oh, she had some babies. Bunch of little bitty catfish. And he got to looking, and on the back of her head, of Grandma's head, was that iron skillet. And it was still tied on with all that line that he had put on it. And he got to squinting even more, looking down at the water, and all them little bitty catfish, they all had little bitty skillets tied to the back of their heads.